This is Think Energy, the podcast that helps you better understand the fast-changing world of energy through conversations with game changers, industry leaders, and influencers. So join me, Dan Seguin, as I explore both traditional and unconventional facets of the energy industry. Hey everyone, welcome back. Meeting Canada's long-term climate goals will require a profound transformation of contemporary systems in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of these major transitions we're seeing around the world is with the energy sector. Canada is certainly at the forefront of the energy transition movement and seen as a leader on the world stage thanks to its targets to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But there's another much closer interim deadline looming with respect to Canada's net zero targets, and that's the decarbonization of Canada's entire electricity sector by 2035. If we don't achieve that, it's very unlikely we'll meet our 2050 climate goal. In fact, many experts believe there is no pathway to net zero without zero-emission electricity. Although Canada's electricity sector is currently 82% emission-free today, removing the remaining fossil fuels from our system is still an ambitious goal to achieve in under 12 years, mainly because we don't have one national electricity grid. We have multiple electricity grids overseen by their respective province or territory. To further complicate matters, different regions in Canada have different resources. Some are water-rich, while others are rich in oil and gas. And, of course, there's also regional politics and economics at play. As we move forward in the new world of electrification, from transportation to how we heat and cool our homes and businesses, it's believed that we will need a lot more electricity than currently produced. So here's today's big question. What is it going to take to achieve the federal government's target to have 100% emission-free electricity by 2035? Today, my special guest is Moe Kabbara, Vice President of the Transition Accelerator, a national not-for-profit organization that is working to advance Canada's 2050 climate targets in multiple sectors. Our guest oversees a new initiative called Electrifying Canada, and we're going to talk about that and the need for an integrated electricity grid in Canada. Moe, welcome to the show. Now, perhaps you can start by telling us a bit about yourself and how the Transition Accelerator came to be.
Yeah, so my name is Moe Kabbara. I'm the Vice President at the Transition Accelerator. My background has been in clean energy and climate for over a decade now. Started working in sort of applied research context on renewables and energy storage. I had a thermal energy storage startup in Atlantic Canada, and then I worked in energy efficiency consulting. I worked in investment attraction for automotive sector and batteries, specifically related to EVs. And then I went back into consulting, worked on various projects when it comes to like electricity, electric vehicles, battery supply chain. And I've been with the Accelerator, since last year. And the Accelerator came to be around 2019. Really with the idea or the basic philosophy that sort of emphasizes that, linking climate concerns to broader efforts to really improve society and steer disruptive and transformative changes that are going to be reshaping the world around us. So it's really based on this idea of transition. And the idea of transition is not necessarily just about the technology itself, but it's about all the different political, social, economic aspects that come with it. So really the methodology that the Accelerator has and established, which is basically the methodology or theory of change of how do we actually get to transition the systems that we need to bring new systems that we need to bring forward. And it's really starts with examining the issue. So it's really starts with our first kind of approach is understanding. So understanding what are the current systems that we use, how did they come to be, and basically understand the forces that are disrupting the existing ways that we do things. The second approach is co-developing. So working with stakeholders to co-develop the pathways for the future. The number three is analyzing those pathways and assessing things like costs and benefits and trade-offs and public accessibility and barriers and bottlenecks. And then the fourth thing, which is how do we get things into the real world, which is advancing. And we've been working on kind of spinning off consortia and alliances that actually are supposed to be implementing the pathways. So it's not just about, we're not, we like to say we're not a think tank, we're a do tank. So that's kind of our approach and philosophy overall.
Okay. How about we dive into your newly launched initiative, Electrifying Canada? What is it all about?
Yeah, I mean, the idea really came to be that Electrifying Canada is an initiative that brings together stakeholders from industry, labor, Indigenous groups, civil society, all have a vested interest in accelerating end-use electrification and the build-out of a net zero electricity system. And basically, our vision is that we see that widespread electrification can enable an affordable and resilient clean energy system that powers Canada's economy and kind of gives us that competitive edge when it comes to industrial activities as well. So really the idea there is that we know electrification is going to be a critical path to get to net zero. We could talk about all the other solutions like hydrogen and RNG and the role that they can play, which is great. But what we really know right now is that electrification is a ready-to-go solution that we need to start on regardless. So it's really about trying to get different stakeholders together, the right voices, the key voices that are needed for action. And that includes, the major electricity users, so that we needed voice. That's like companies that need electricity or sectors like transportation and buildings that are going to be in need of electricity to decarbonize. That also includes the supply side of the conversation, so the utilities and the developers and the regulators. So that's the we can build it voice. And then the finance community that is looking for investment opportunities in this space and is going to finance this. So the bank, the pension fund, the financial institutions, but then also bringing in civil society, so NGOs, think tanks, that are working on advancing solutions in the space. So it's really, you can think of it as an umbrella initiative, try to bring everybody that's working on this topic under its wings. And we've successfully done that. We have 28 partners that includes all the major players in the country working on electrification. And then the sort of activities that we're going to be looking at include research, analysis, public outreach, engagement, developing policy frameworks. So we are going to be going across the country this month, starting next week until April. We're going to be visiting 8 cities. So we're going to actually meet people in person, and meet them where they're at, both physically and metaphorically speaking. And that's going to be the first step to establish the forum, which is we're seeing as not just a one-off conversation, but as an extended forum to have collaboration, coordination, and partnerships. So we're very excited about this initiative, and that's kind of very quickly what we're at.
Moe, can you remind us what some of Canada's key target dates are?
Yeah, I mean, just the very, very big picture, Canada has committed to reaching net zero across all sectors by 2050. And then when we look at some of the sectoral targets, we have a target to get to a net zero electricity grid by 2035, 100% new sales of vehicles being zero emissions by 2035, 60% of new vehicles being zero emissions by 2030. Building sectoral contribution, emission reduction 40% reduction by 2030. So a lot of these different targets when it comes to decarbonization of the building sector and transportation sector and the electricity system, all going to require huge efforts today and that we need to get working on right away. So these are very ambitious targets, and we definitely support them. But that means that we really need to understand the barriers and advance solutions very quickly, because we're going to meet those targets. We're going to be, we need everybody to come on board and to really have a concrete strategic approach to the widespread electrification and the build out of electricity systems.
Okay, for a follow-up question, Moe, what does electrification mean? And are these targets driving it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that really, if you think about it, so electrification is basically moving away from technologies that use fossil fuels, so that's coal, oil, or natural gas, with technologies that use electricity as a source of energy. So depending on how you generate electricity, electrification can be zero emission, right? So the idea is that if I have electricity coming from solar, and I use that I use electricity to charge my EV, then my EV is zero emission, both at the source and also in terms of the upstream emissions. But if I have a gasoline in my vehicle, there's really no net zero compatible pathway to getting, I can continue on improving the emission standards of the vehicle, but at the end of the day, I'm limited by the laws of thermodynamics, that I'm always going to have emissions and low efficiency for internal combustion engines. So electrification is really using electricity as a source of energy, as opposed to fossil fuels or molecule fuels. And basically the notion of if we can get electrons instead of molecule fuels, and if we can get those electrons to be centralized in terms of production and clean electricity, then we can use that to decarbonize our sectors. So the targets that I mentioned, they're not necessarily prescriptive on exactly how to decarbonize. So zero emission vehicles include things like fuel cell vehicles and like hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. But the clearest pathway right now in terms of what are some of the ready to go solutions that we can implement today would be electrification. So that's why those targets are driving the need to electrify, because it is something that we can get started right away and the technology is available. So electric vehicles have ramped up significantly over the last few years. Battery costs have gone down by 90% for the last 10 years. Heat pumps are also available and ready to go to decarbonize our buildings. So I think that's really what's driving electrification, is because it's a very clear path to get started on right now.
So will electrification mean that we will need more electricity? And if so, how much more?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Definitely, it's going to mean that we're going to need more electricity, because we're going to be, displacing fossil fuel use with another source of energy, which is electricity. So that has to come from somewhere. The debate, and it's not very clear. That's part of what we're doing now with Electrifying Canada, is we're doing a meta-analysis of all the studies that have been published over the last 18 months to look at what is the expected demand growth. If just a quick scan of literature for the Canadian analysis that has been done, we're looking at maybe doubling our electricity grid. Some people say we're going to triple it. I'm not too concerned about whether it's double or triple right now. I mean, obviously, it's a very big difference, but what's clear is that we need to get started on the pathway over the next few years is going to be the same, whether it's double or triple. So we need to really understand what are some of the near-term opportunities and near-term challenges. So we're going to need a lot more electricity, but also some of the need for electricity is not going to materialize overnight, right? So people are like, well, we can't electrify transportation because we don't have enough electricity. But transitioning our transportation sector to EVs doesn't happen overnight. It's something that it follows sort of a technology diffusion theory of it's not every vehicle in one neighborhood is going to become EV overnight and plug in. So the idea is that we can actually plan for the increased electrification, increased electricity demand, and um, things like energy efficiency and demand side management and demand response and distributed energy resources. All of these different measures can be very critical to reduce our increased demand, so that we don't I think of that as that's the cheapest resource. Like if we can avoid using electricity, that's going to be our first cheapest resource, and then we can build out the delta between what we can't basically what we can't reduce completely, right? So the idea is that we're going to need a lot more electricity, but also there are ways to basically mitigate the impact on the grid and make sure that it's not necessarily very costly relatively to the baseline scenario.
Who are some of the partners in the Electrifying Canada initiative, and what does their involvement mean to achieve your overall mission?
Yeah, I mean, so we brought together, as I mentioned, on the demand side, companies like Tech Resources and Rio Tinto. On the supply side, we have the Electricity Alliance of Canada, which includes the 6 industry associations. So that's Electricity Canada, the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, the Canadian Nuclear Association, Marine Renewables, Water Power Canada, and Electricity HR. And also we have individual companies like Interject, OPG as well, organizations like OPG Hydro One. And then on the civil society front, we got Pembina Institute, Net Zero Atlantic, Glass. On labor, we've got IBEW, the International Brotherhoods of Electric Workers. Also, we have First Nation Major Project Coalition. So it's really a broad coalition. And in terms of their involvement, really it's about bringing the different voices together that are needed for action. So understanding the barriers, prioritizing those barriers, understanding the solutions, prioritizing the solutions, and getting sort of a shared vision of what we need to be working on, on a national level, but also at the regional level. So that's why we're doing a regional approach in terms of, figuring out for each province what is the framework that we need to be working on to get to net zero electricity. So we're very happy to bring together, as I mentioned, 28 organizations that span, the whole supply chain of electricity, but also include civil society, Indigenous people, labor, and also the finance community.
Now, Moe, in addition to affordable, resilient, and clean, what are some of the other qualities you're looking to achieve in your mission to electrify Canada?
Well, I think that really thinking through accessibility and make sure that the electricity is available to everybody in terms of different regional perspective and different regional representation. So I think that if we can get an electricity system that is actually affordable, so we don't bankrupt people for energy, which is really critical for us. So that's kind of like the trilemma there, and I think there is a balance there to be struck between affordable, resilient, resilient and reliable. I would put them in the same kind of box, and then clean. So for me, really, the vision is quite simple, and we wanted to keep it simple because it's simple, but it's not easy, right? So we know what we need to do. We know what kind of characteristics we want our future electricity system to look like and our future energy system to have. But getting there is going to be the challenge. So our philosophy at the Accelerator is we're starting with the end state, knowing that we need an electricity system that is affordable, resilient, and clean, and then working backwards from there.
Okay. Maybe you can unpack your plans for public outreach, and what are you hoping to learn from these more regional conversations?
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to be going to Vancouver, Regina, Winnipeg, Calgary, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, St. John's, and we're going to be doing also northern communities and Indigenous communities online workshop. To start off, really what we want to do is establish a baseline. So one is we want to understand where each region is at in terms of their understanding of the challenges at the regional level. So we're sort of established something called we want to establish something called a real world overlay, and it's a framework to really ground everything that we know is a barrier or an issue that will stop us from getting to net zero electricity. So that includes things like rate increases, that includes things like supply chain constraints, labor constraints, skills needed. So all of these different barriers, we talk about them, they're around, people keep mentioning them, but they're just kind of floating in the air, like I imagine them more like floating like a cloud. And part of our objective is to really ground them somewhere so we can actually keep track of them. So what we're hoping to establish is this framework that would be public, co-developed. So it's not just us doing it, it's the stakeholders informing it through the sessions that we're hosting and through the relationships that we're building and the partners that we've brought into the initiative. And then having it be evergreen and public so that really, if you think of it, this can be the sort of centralized forum for tracking all the barriers and solutions that are being implemented to address those barriers. So if Quebec or BC wants to implement a trial rate structure for low-income households, this framework would track that over time so that others who are working on these issues can go in and learn from that in a very kind of centralized and consolidated framework.
Now, why are Canada's electricity systems central to the country's net zero 2050 goals? Do we have a clean energy advantage?
Yeah, I mean, more than 80% of our electricity is already non-emitting, which is great, like relatively to other countries. So that's really it's one of our biggest value proposition as well. Like when thinking about attracting new supply chains like battery manufacturing and critical minerals extraction, for example. And the idea there is we want to retain that advantage as we, potentially double or triple our grid, right? So the core thesis there is that we want to basically build a future electricity system that builds on the clean electricity advantage that we have, retains it, and it's going to be, as I mentioned, if we're going to use electrification as a key pathway to get to net zero, then that electricity has to be clean. So this is why a net zero electricity system is critical.
Okay, Mo, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges to the creation of a national strategy and a zero-emission pan-Canadian electricity grid?
Well, I think the idea there is that we don't have one grid, right? So that's one of the challenges to start with, is because we have sort of a decentralized federation. So I think there's that to create a national strategy, it will require each province to understand where they're at and where they want to get to. And right now, it's not a uniform. We're not like in the uniform state in terms of every province kind of understanding that those conditions. So BC and Quebec maybe very different than Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So we don't have sort of clarity on that common framework. So I would say in terms of the biggest challenge to creating a national strategy is that we need to have each province kind of understand and get its ducks in a row before we can really put all the pieces of the puzzle together.
Okay. And in your view, Mo, who leads this and is best positioned to address structural and regulatory obstacles?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why we wanted to bring and build this coalition, because at the end of the day, you need industry at the table, you need indigenous peoples at the table, you need civil society, you need labor. So it can't be just government on its own. It can't be just industry on its own. So what we're hoping that this initiative will do is provide the sort of a good framework to start tackling these issues. And in terms of the regulatory changes, I think there's a role, obviously, for the provinces, for the provincial governments. There's a key role for the federal government, and we're seeing like things like the development of the clean electricity regulation, and the Fed's playing that role. So I think that, but it can't just be government, and it has to be sort of a broader coalition, and that's kind of why we're this is part of our fourth step in the accelerator, which is advancing solutions. It's building these consortia and these alliances that can really make sure that we converge on the next steps, and we're not really talking past each other. So I think that provincial governments, Crown Corp, utilities, vertically integrated utilities in certain provinces, understanding where they're at and modernizing the sort of regulatory frameworks so that clean electricity is also part of the mandate of the utilities, which is not necessarily the case right now, is something that is going to be critical.
Now, time for the crystal ball. What kinds of major investments need to be made to reach the 2035 timeline?
Well, I think it's really a lot of investments in new infrastructure, so generation, so renewables and other non-emitting electricity, and transmission, distribution. It's really about kind of fully integrated investment strategy that looks at, how much more generation do we need? Can we offset some of that additional generation needs with transmission? Okay, but then at the distribution level, what's going on there when it comes to substations and transformers? Like if you look at, for example, electric vehicle adoption, the bottleneck is not going to be whether we have electricity at the generation level. Like the bottleneck is going to be, we have the infrastructure at neighborhood levels, right? Like where the transformers and the substations be able to handle all the EVs that are materializing, and it's going to be more of an issue in certain areas than others. So I would say, really, the major investments are not just going to be we need to build solar and wind. It's going to be looking at all the solutions on generation, solar, wind, nuclear, hydro, potentially in terms of increasing some hydro capacity using more efficient turbines, for example, and then storage, making sure that we have energy storage that can help offset or some of the increased generation needs, so that we can have more reliable electricity. And then on the transmission side, looking at opportunities for regional transmission if possible, and that can help be a more cost-effective way to get electricity added to the capacity of the system. And then on the distribution side, really looking at the local distribution networks and how it's the modernization of the assets there basically meet the demand side that's materializing from transportation and building electrification.
And Moe, are intermittent renewable sources, district energy resources, and non-wire alternatives being considered, and at what scale?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a great question. So I think that for a lot of different jurisdictions, especially in the U.S. and even here at home, are considering things like non-wired alternatives and distributed energy resources as a way to mitigate some of the major investments required at the distribution level, and potentially even at the transmission level. So I think that we need to basically try to find as much cost savings as possible across the supply chain or across the ecosystem. So thinking through generation, we have to find sort of the most effective low cost electricity, but then thinking through at the distribution level, if we can use things like demand response, non-wired alternative, distributed energy generation to mitigate some of the heavy high costs of distribution assets, then I think that's something that is being considered, and we're doing. I've been involved in sort of a comparative analysis in the U.S. to look at what would it cost if we just kind of do traditional distribution, and what would it cost if we did non-wired alternatives, and then what are the cost benefits there. So I think that is something. It's one of the tools in the toolbox for sure.
Now, Canada is a major fossil fuel exporter, with the oil and gas sector generating substantial revenues and supporting thousands of jobs. But oil and gas also contribute 26% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. How do we approach this issue thoughtfully to achieve our climate goals?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are opportunities to really look at the upstream emissions um, from the oil and gas sector and actually using electrification to help decarbonize the oil and gas sector as well. So thinking through, this you have the actual emissions that come from burning gas, and then you have the actual emissions that come from producing it. So if we're thinking about the production emissions, there are going to be a lot of opportunities to leverage new technologies like carbon capture, electrification, like even thinking about the hydrogen that is currently used in the oil and gas sector that's maybe coming from what we call black hydrogen, turning that into blue or green hydrogen. So there's a lot of actually low-hanging fruits that can really help us reduce a lot of the oil and gas emissions that are coming from production. And then, but I think what we're interested in as well is understanding what are the opportunities coming up from an industrial strategy or industrial perspective that can help us, grow sectors for the Canadian economy. So I'm the co-chair of the Canadian Battery Task Force. So it's a task force that's focused on basically growing Canada's battery supply chain and electric vehicle manufacturing. So in that sense, the auto sector contributes 500,000 jobs directly and indirectly. It's a huge contributor to GDP. How do we make sure that we retain that advantage or retain that contribution to the sectors, but also grow it? Because we want to be able to diversify our economy and be part of a green industrial future. So at the Accelerator, one of the things that we're very interested in is industrial policy that is focused on competitiveness and understanding where that competitiveness comes from in terms of the emerging sectors. So things like zero emission vehicles, biofuels, hydrogen, aviation fuels, mass timber, critical minerals. So we need to basically understand these opportunities that are emerging as part of this new world order of green industrial futures, and understand how Canada can play in that, so that on the export table, that we're able to sort of elevate some of those sectors to be able to fill some of the gaps that will come into play as part of the net zero world that is emerging in terms of decreasing reliance on fossil fuels.
Now, how does your initiative, Electrifying Canada, fit in the federal government's plan to create a pan-Canadian grid council?
Yeah, so we're working very closely with Natural Resources Canada. They're very supportive of this initiative, and we're still kind of keeping our ear to the ground when it comes to the National Grid Council. But we hope that basically this initiative can be sort of a parallel process in terms of really having intel research convening that can feed into the Grid Council, because the idea is the Grid Council is not going to be able to bring together hundreds of people, right? It's going to be more, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it will be a bit more a smaller scale. So the hope there is that the regional engagements that we're doing, the sort of more granular analysis that we're doing, can help feed into some of the recommendations and feedback from the Grid Council. So it's kind of like a parallel process.
Okay. Now, let's go beyond the borders here. What can we learn from the EU or Denmark or other Nordic countries with respect to their cooperation to expand the electricity grid and decarbonize it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that for Denmark and for the rest of Europe, really kind of showcasing the advantage they've had when it comes to renewable energy development, and focusing also on sort of the green electricity advantage. So some of the collaborations or the integrations that we've seen, even actually in Switzerland, it's really about grid integration and integrating different grids together. So in Switzerland, we had a little bit more of decentralized structure, and there was an initiative in the last few years to kind of bring it together into sort of a digital, using technology and digitization and sort of modernization efforts to be able to integrate demand supply in Switzerland and make it a bit more of a sort of a national grid. So I think that the lessons there's a lot of lessons to be learned. The idea of electricity supply and security of supply is very big in Europe right now, and I think there was a bit of a sort of a force of hand given the crisis in Ukraine that kind of pushed for accelerated the need for integration. And I think that that was a very critical aspect of what some of the trends we're seeing in terms of grid integration there.
Okay. Now, what about lessons from discussions happening with respect to the Atlantic Loop? Do you have an update on that?
Well, I think the Atlantic Loop, it's going to be, it's very interesting to see. It really highlighted that there's a lot of challenges when it comes to actually building a major project like that. We're still kind of waiting to see, especially given, Nova Scotia Energy Board basically put a cap on rate increases, which basically prompted Nova Scotia Power and Emera to say that they're going to they're being put in a position where they can't invest if they can't recover costs from ratepayers. So I think that it's still something that is going to be a very positive precedent for us in Canada, that we can bring together these multiple provinces together, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, Quebec, going through New Brunswick. So I think it's going to be a critical project to reach the net zero targets for Atlantic Canada, right? So especially for Nova Scotia. So I think that it's going to be interesting to do like a little bit of a postmortem, hopefully after it's done, to basically dissect some of the lessons learned in terms of the barriers of bringing together, the different provinces and different electricity systems, and also like different structures of the utilities, right? So Nova Scotia Power has a different structure than New Brunswick Power and Newfoundland Hydro and Hydro-Quebec. So,
Mo, what are the biggest obstacles with our provinces when it comes to cooperation and successfully achieving an integrated grid? How can Electrifying Canada play a role?
So I think we don't want to overpromise, and I think part of what we're trying to do in a very genuine way is to really help, kind of, like I mentioned before, ground all these different issues and put them somewhere so we can actually understand and be clear that we're all looking at the same thing. We all have this sort of shared understanding of the baseline of where we're at. So I think for provinces, a big part of it is communication and integration. So a lot of provinces don't necessarily know what other provinces are doing. So when I worked as a consultant, a big part of what we did for a lot of our clients was jurisdictional scans. So we'd be talking to a utility in BC or a utility in Alberta, and they'd be like, "Well, what's somebody doing? What are they doing in Quebec?" And I think that kind of knowledge sharing is not necessarily there sometimes. And so I think it's something very simple, but it's something that is going to be very critical, because it's a way for us to turn the challenges of a decentralized federation into an advantage in terms of running different experiments in different places, because we are able to do that. So trying different rate structures in different provinces, trying different programs in different provinces. So what we're trying to do with overcoming the provincial barriers is to really offer those lessons learned and best practices, consolidating them into a framework that we're developing, ensuring that we are kind of that conduit for information sharing and for integration and collaboration.
Okay. Polar opposites now. What are the biggest opportunities that provinces and territories could benefit from with an integrated grid?
Well, I think biggest opportunity would be to really take advantage of the differences in the provincial systems. So a province that has a lot of wind versus a province that has a lot of solar versus a province that has a lot of hydro. You can basically look at these systems and try to develop an integrated approach so that it will be overall cheaper for them to basically work together and take advantage of the different technologies that they have, right? So I think really at the end of the day, it's cost reduction and being able to meet their targets, in a way that ensures the affordable, resilient, reliable, and clean electricity system.
Okay, so does reaching the 2035 targets hinge on a unified and integrated grid across Canada, or can it be achieved without it?
Well, no, I don't. I don't think it hinges on a unified electricity grid. I think we need to. The reality is that we do have multiple grids and multiple systems, and that we need to start from that position. We need to look at a national approach that can basically help us reduce costs, ensure more reliability, and cleaner system. But I don't think necessarily, it's either or. It's not like we either have a national grid or we're never get to net zero. I think it's more about integrating as much as possible to reduce barriers and to reduce costs.
Now, looking forward to your response to this next question, is there a huge communication challenge to overcome? I read in the Transition Accelerator's report, Building Path to a Sustainable Future, that this shouldn't be framed as just about electricity or technology, or even net zero emissions. How do you think electrification and the climate conversation should be positioned?
I think the climate conversation really, at the end of the day, for us, it's trying to keep up with the world that's moving very quickly. So we have things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., and we have industrial policies emerging in Europe, and all of that is leading us down a path of green industrial growth and industrial future. So people are driving EVs. One, yeah, sure, because of emissions, but really it's because they're more efficient, they're more reliable in terms of you can just come home, charge it, and you never have to go to a gas station. Yeah, sure, there are issues with range, but for 99% of the time, it's not really an issue. So we're seeing sort of a lot of technologies come up, and we kind of see the climate and net zero emission aspect is sort of secondary or like a byproduct of the green industrial transition. And in terms of Canada's position, we want to be able to participate and get all of the economic benefits that come from this, so and be an actual global leader in these key sectors. And we do have that opportunity because we have access to critical minerals and metals. We have access to technology and intellectual property development that's happening here at home. We have the electricity advantage. So for us, really, the framing is about how do we position Canada to be an economic powerhouse when it comes to green technology? Because green technology is obviously going to be needed for climate change, and that's where but really at the end of the day, it's about taking advantage of the economic benefits that come with that, and as well as so it's part of the two sides of the same coin. And given how the world is shifting, especially as I mentioned in Europe and the US, the demand is there. And how do we basically position ourselves to be able to take advantage of that growing demand and be an exporter of these different technologies to the world?
Okay, do you truly think we lack a shared vision as Canadians on the future, and how do we get there together? How do we fix it?
Well, I think initiatives like Electrifying Canada and initiatives that we're doing as well when it comes to zero emission vehicle supply chain and building electrification and all these, we're involved in several initiatives. Is the first step, right? So I think it's really about understanding what the future could look like. What are our strengths? What what's our value proposition as a country, and then using these conversations and forums and convening aspects to really as sort of a key tool to create a shared vision. I think that also, making sure that we have communication, collaboration between provincial energy jurisdictions is going to be critical. So, yeah, I mean, I think for us, we really believe that advancing solutions means bringing the actual people and the stakeholders that are involved in implementing the solutions together, and creating consistent forms of collaboration. So if we look at Europe, the European Battery Alliance, they brought together hundreds of stakeholders, and they've successfully started to build out a very sophisticated battery supply chain in Europe. So this kind of private-public partnership, through a third-party intermediary, we see that as a very critical tool to actually reaching a shared vision.
Now, there is something I know that's on the top of the list of considerations: customer affordability. What are your thoughts on how we can achieve our goals while maintaining costs for customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the process that we're going through is to actually land on solutions for that issue. And those solutions could be different for different provinces and different regions. I think that I don't really have the answer, but there's a lot of smart people that we have brought together, and part of this Electrifying Canada initiative have ideas. And like I mentioned before, we need to basically consider those ideas, maybe do some trials. I'll give just one example. One thing could be like a means-tested rate structure for low-income households, right? So it's like, but it's also thinking about and talking about how energy costs can be reduced because of efficiencies gained through electrification. So if you are somebody that drives a car and has baseboard heaters in Quebec, for example, if you get an electric vehicle and if you get heat pumps, your energy consumption will actually be reduced. So even if rates increase by a little bit, your overall energy costs could potentially be much lower than the existing energy costs. So there's a lot of nuance there, and I think that we need to be careful that nobody's left behind, and design our structures in terms of rate structures and how we manage energy costs to make sure that affordability is top of mind, right? So I think this is something that is there's no one answer for every single province or every single region in the country. There's going to be multiple solutions that we can try out, multiple suite of solutions that are going to work hand in hand. And we're motivated that by bringing together the coalition that we brought together, we're basically going to be able to get to the answers and advance those solutions.
Now, Moe, are you looking at opportunities to integrate our electricity grid with the U.S.? What are the benefits that could help modernize and even optimize our grid with a U.S. partnership?
I think that's a great conversation. One of our partners, was in the U.S. Recently to have that exact conversation. I would say at a high level, we should be exploring all opportunities when it comes to integration, whether it's regional within Canada or cross-border. Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, it's about, it's very simple. If I have excess and you have demand, and then let's make sure that my excess goes to your demand. If you have access and I have demand, let's make sure that your excess comes to my demand. And then as a way to reduce, cost, because then, okay, well, I'm not going to overbuild my generation because there's sort of a pathway for me to meet my demand, knowing that there's excess electricity coming from across the border or vice versa. So I think that the integration with the U.S. is something that is critical for us to consider. But also, it's going to be a lot easier once we have our ducks in a row within Canada, right? So once we have our own strategy and our understanding of what is the delta between what we can do in house, what is the delta between what we can export, what is our excess, that's going to make the conversation. We're going to be coming to the conversation from a position strength and position and an advantage, right? So I think that it's something that is top of mind, but it seems a little bit down the road from today. I mean, we already have integration with the U.S., obviously, but in terms of that broader integration, it seems like the conversation is a little bit in the early stages.
Moe, lastly, what's exciting you and giving you hope about the possibility of an integrated and zero-emission electricity grid?
Yeah, I mean, it's really what's exciting me is that we are going to be able to really decarbonize a huge amount of a lot of our sectors on buildings, transportation, industrial, agriculture, and really the idea of having a fully net zero grid. I mean, for Canada, as I mentioned, we're largely not emitting, which has been great, but to get to net zero, and what I'm really optimistic about is seeing all of the different efforts that are happening when it comes to electricity generation, when it comes to developing some kind of policy certainty for investors. So, and as I mentioned, this is sort of a trend that is an industrial economic trend. So I'm excited to see that coupling that's happening, where it's like it's not either or. It's really this is where the world is headed. This is where the money's at. This is where the economy is going at a global level. We need to get there, and hey, guess what? As part of this, we get to also get to net zero and help address climate change. So I think that's really what's exciting for me at this point in time, is that we've reached the stage where there is that integration between economics and climate.
Okay, sir, we always end our interviews with some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
Moe, what are you reading right now?
I'm rereading a book called Electrification by Saul Griffith from Rewiring America.
Now, what would you name your boat if you had one, or maybe you do have one?
I don't. I guess transatlantic.
Okay. Now, who is someone that you admire?
I really admire Bruce Laurie from the Ivy Foundation, because I recently had an amazing conversation with him, and kind of the work that he's done, especially to get Ontario off coal.
This next one is always a challenging one. What is the closest thing to real magic that you've witnessed?
I guess diving underwater.
Now, what is the biggest challenge to you personally since the pandemic began?
I guess when live music went away, that was tough.
Okay, last one here. We've all been watching a lot more Netflix and TV lately. What's your favorite movie or show?
I really loved Succession, an HBO show.
Okay, Moe, lastly, what is exciting you about your industry right now?
What's really exciting me is the growth. It's really seeing how fast we're growing. That it's not necessarily, it is mainstream now. It is the future. We've hit that point of inevitability, and it's extremely exciting to see that.
Okay, so this is it. We've reached the end of another episode of the Think Energy podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, Moe. If our listeners want to learn more about you or your organization, how can they connect?
Yeah, we're at transitionaccelerator.ca, and you can go there and find our contact info. Also on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn. Happy to connect with folks, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, Dan.
Cool. Okay, thanks. Now, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you had a lot of fun. Cheers.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Think Energy podcast. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening. And to find out more about today's guest or previous episodes, visit thinkenergypodcast.com. I hope you'll join us again next time as we spark even more conversations about the energy of tomorrow.